You ever wake up and just know something is different? Not the alarm, not the light, not even the sound of the recyclers humming outside your module wall, just something in the air, something sitting wrong, something that makes you lie there for a second, staring at the ceiling before your brain has even caught up to what your gut already figured out. That was me. That was my morning. On a planet that doesn't even have a proper name yet, just a catalog designation, KV-7 Outpost Bravo, sitting at the edge of the Velthari contested zone like a forgotten matchstick someone dropped in the grass. I had built something the night before, a little shelter, something stupid and small and barely worth thinking about. Just some thermal mesh, a few scavenged panels, and my own two hands doing something they probably shouldn't have been doing. I built it for a cub. One cub. One lonely, shivering, copper-eyed beast cub that I had no business feeding, and every reason in the world to leave alone. I woke up to 4. And that right there is how everything changed. Not just for me, not just for the outpost, for all of us. For every human soul sitting on that frozen little rock trying to prove that we belonged somewhere in a galaxy that kept telling us we didn't. Let me back up. Let me tell you how I got there. Because nothing about that morning made sense unless you understand the week that came before it. Section 2, The Setup. My name is Darius Kale. I'm a forward logistics specialist, which sounds important until you realize it mostly means I drive supply crawlers through mud, fix broken atmospheric seals in the rain, and file requisition forms that nobody reads. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in New Asheville, which was what they were calling the rebuilt section of western North Carolina after the enclosure storms. My mother was a nurse. My father fixed old combustion engines for fun. I mention that because I think it matters. I think who you come from shapes the kind of stupid decisions you make later. I volunteered for the Frontier Expansion Program 3 years ago, not out of patriotism, not out of some burning desire to represent humanity in the stars. Honestly, I needed to get somewhere far away from a situation back home that I'm not going to talk about today. The FEP was offering full debt clearance and a 10-year land grant on any established colony world to anyone who did 2 full rotations on a contested frontier post. 2 rotations, 2 years. Seemed doable. KV-7, Outpost Bravo did not seem doable when I first arrived. It was a base of maybe 80 people, mostly humans, 63 of us last count, a handful of allied species, 3 Davari engineers who communicated entirely through hand gestures and refused to eat in the same room as anyone else, 2 Suleni medics who were perfectly kind but had this habit of blinking very slowly at you when you said something they found culturally confusing, which happened about 40 times a day, and 1 Garatai interpreter named Asiv who had been stationed here for so long that he had started picking up human slang, and now used it badly and out of context in ways that made every conversation slightly exhausting. The planet itself was KV-7. That's it. That's all anybody called it. It had a Velthari name that roughly translated to the place where the sky argues with the ground, which, when you saw the weather, you understood immediately. The atmosphere was thick. The pressure was higher than Earth standard by about 12%, which meant you felt it in your joints after a few weeks. The sky was this greenish-gray that looked like a bruise, and it was almost never fully bright, more like a long, permanent twilight that occasionally got brighter in the middle of the day, and then went back to that bruised color. The flora was dense, thick, red-stemmed vegetation that grew in mats across the lowlands, something like fern trees in the higher elevations, with black bark and silver leaves that made a sound like static electricity when the wind moved through them. You got used to it. You either got used to it or you lost your mind, and losing your mind on a frontier post had real consequences, so most people chose to get used to it. The fauna was the part that got complicated. KV-7 was home to the Brath. Now, if you've never heard of the Brath, which you probably haven't, because they're not a species that the Galactic Compact particularly likes to talk about for reasons that will become relevant later. I'll describe them as best I can. They were large. Adult Brath were somewhere between a bear and a lion in terms of general body shape, but that comparison really doesn't do it justice. They moved differently. They were built for a heavier gravity world than this one, so on KV-7 they were almost unnervingly agile, like watching something that should be slow move at speeds that made no sense for its mass. 6 limbs, though the front 2 had evolved into something between arms and legs. They could run on all 6 or rear up and use the front 2 as manipulators. Their heads were broad and flat-faced, with those copper-colored eyes that had vertical slits for pupils. Their fur, if you could call it that, was more like dense interlocking plates of something semi-rigid, almost like pangolin scales made of the same material as fingernails, but flexible and layered so they could move freely underneath. The color varied. Most of the adults I'd seen were deep charcoal, almost black, with amber or copper patterns along the neck and jaw. The cubs, though, the cubs looked completely different. They were soft where the adults were hard. Their plate fur hadn't fully developed. They had this covering that was closer to thick, dense wool, in colors that ranged from pale gray to rust orange. Their eyes were enormous relative to their faces in the way that young mammals usually are, and their ears, huge, triangular, independently rotating ears, were too big for their heads and made them look, honestly, a little ridiculous. In the way that a puppy is ridiculous. In the way that makes you do something you shouldn't. The Galactic Compact had classified the Brath as Category 3 uncontacted sentience. That meant do not approach, do not interfere, do not feed, do not make contact, do not do anything that might alter the natural development of a species in the early stages of what the Compact called autonomous cognitive emergence, which is a very long way of saying the Brath were showing signs of being on the edge of developing language, tools, and organized social behavior. And the Compact had a policy, heavily enforced, with serious legal consequences, about not influencing species that were at that stage. The Velthari enforced that policy on KV-7 personally. They had a garrison 20 kilometers northeast of our outpost. I'd seen their ships. Everybody had. Long, dark, angular things that moved too quietly for their size, with hull markings in deep violet that I'd been told were territorial declarations but looked to me like warnings. The Velthari themselves I had seen exactly twice in person. Once at a joint resource summit when I'd been part of the supply logistics team, and once when a patrol had passed close enough to our perimeter fence to be visible through binoculars. They were tall, very tall. Thin in a way that suggested their homeworld was lower gravity than standard. Their faces were narrow and angular with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, and a mouth that was a horizontal slit that didn't move much when they communicated. Most of their language was subsonic and infrasonic, things you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. They wore environmental suits that adjusted color based on ambient light, which made them hard to track visually in the field. They moved with a kind of deliberate precision that I found unsettling in the way that very controlled things are always a little unsettling. The Velthari had been on KV-7 for 40 years. They believed it was theirs. The Compact had been arguing about that claim for 20 of those 40 years. In the meantime, both sides had agreed to allow observation outposts on the planet, which was diplomatic language for, we're both going to sit here and watch each other and try not to shoot first. We were the observation outpost. And the rule, the absolute law that Commander Thea Vasquez had drilled into every single one of us from the moment we arrived was this: do not touch the Brath. Do not feed the Brath. Do not interact with the Brath in any way. If a Brath approaches you, retreat slowly and report it. If a Brath is injured on outpost grounds, contact Compact Wildlife Management and wait for their drone team. Do not intervene. I had followed that rule for 22 months. I broke it on a Tuesday. The week before the shelter, we'd had a bad one. Supply crawler KV-706 had thrown a differential coupling 3 clicks from the outpost in the middle of a storm system that brought visibility down to about 8 meters. I'd spent 6 hours out there in the rain, in a pressure suit that was not designed for 6 hours of kneeling in mud, fixing a part with tools that kept slipping because my hands were tired, while the storm made that static electricity sound in the fern trees above me, and the whole world smelled like copper and wet stone. I got back to the outpost, I ate something, I filed my repair report, I went to my module. And that's when I heard it. My module was in the outer ring, which was the least desirable real estate on the outpost, obviously, because it was closest to the perimeter fence and farthest from the central heat distribution node. It was also, however, quieter. Fewer people walking past, less ambient noise from the common areas. I'd requested it deliberately, and I didn't regret it. The sound came from the other side of my exterior wall. The space between the module's outer face and the perimeter fence was about 4 meters, a maintenance corridor that we walked maybe once a week to check the fence sensors. Nobody went there otherwise. The sound was small, it was quiet. It was the kind of sound that you could have missed entirely if the storm hadn't paused for exactly 30 seconds at the moment I happened to be sitting on the edge of my bunk, pulling off one boot. It sounded like something crying. Not human crying, not even close, more like a sound that had the shape of crying, the frequency pattern, the rhythm, the hitching quality of it, without being anything a human throat could make. A high, cycling, repeating sound with a kind of hollow resonance, like if you blew across the top of a bottle, but in 3 overlapping tones simultaneously. I sat there for a moment. I put my boot back on. I know that's the moment. That's the moment when the smart thing and the human thing were 2 completely different things, and I picked the human thing. I went outside. I had my handheld torch and I was still in my work clothes. The maintenance corridor between my module and the fence was dark, and the rain had picked back up, but lighter now, more of a mist, really. I walked the length of it slowly, keeping the torch low so I didn't trip on anything. I found the cub tucked into the angle between 2 fence support struts. It was small, way smaller than I'd expected. I'd seen adult Brath from a distance and had calibrated my mental image of what small meant for this species incorrectly, because this cub was about the size of a medium dog. Its wool fur was soaked. Its ears were flattened. Those huge copper eyes caught my torch light and reflected it back at me like mirrors, and it went absolutely still the way small animals do when they've decided that the best survival strategy is to become invisible. I stopped. We looked at each other. I did not approach. I took a step back, actually, because the compact guideline said retreat slowly, and my body remembered that before my brain had fully decided what it was doing. The cub made that sound again, quieter, almost like it was trying not to. Here's the thing about me that I should probably tell you if you're going to understand what happened next. I am not someone who cries easily. I'm not saying that like it's a virtue. My mother used to say that I process things sideways, that instead of feeling it and showing it, I felt it and then did something physical about it, like fixing something or building something, because that was how my brain was wired. She said it like she wasn't sure whether it was a problem or not. I wasn't sure either. What I know is that when I looked at that soaked, shivering, a lone little creature wedged between 2 fence supports in the rain, something happened in my chest that felt like a door opening somewhere I'd kept locked for a while. I did not touch it, I want to be clear about that. I went back inside. But I came back out 20 minutes later with a section of thermal mesh from my emergency kit, the kind we used to wrap exposed conduit in the winter cycles, and I draped it over the angle between the struts from above, creating a sort of low tent, small enough that the cub's body heat would warm it up, with a front gap that the cub could exit through without feeling trapped. I went back inside. I watched through my exterior vent sensor for 45 minutes. The cub moved under the mesh within 3 minutes of me going back in. It curled itself into a compact shape and it stopped making the sound. I went to sleep. Here's the part that matters before I get to the morning of 4. Over the next 3 days, I did a series of increasingly questionable things that I justified to myself, each time with a logic that felt sound in the moment, but, looking back, was really just the logic of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was retroactively building reasons for it. Day 1 after the shelter, the cub was still there, still under the thermal mesh. It had shifted position. It was facing outward now instead of inward, and its ears were up instead of flat. When I came to check the fence sensors in the morning, it watched me from under the mesh. It didn't run. It didn't make the crying sound. It just watched me with those mirror eyes, and I checked the sensors, and I went back inside. Day 1, evening. I looked up Brath cub biology on the Outpost research database. Not the public access summary. I had a logistics clearance that gave me access to the scientific observation archives. I read for 3 hours. Brath cubs, I learned, are semi-precocial. They're born with their eyes open and with the capacity to move independently within about 6 hours of birth. But they have a long dependency period, somewhere between 18 months and 3 years, during which they den with the family unit. A cub separated from the family unit had, according to the data, a survival rate of about 11% without some form of thermal sheltering, because their plate fur didn't complete its development until around the 16-month mark. Before then, they were vulnerable to the temperature drops that hit KV7 during the night cycle. 11%. I did not feed the cub. I want to be very clear. I read the regulations again that night. Feeding was specifically listed as prohibited contact. Making structural changes to the environment to benefit the animal was listed as prohibited contact. I was already technically in violation. But 11%, and it was still there. And there was a gap in the regulations, a very small one, barely worth noticing, but I noticed it, that said intervention is prohibited unless the animal is in acute distress presenting immediate mortality risk due to conditions directly caused by outpost infrastructure. The fence, technically, was outpost infrastructure. The cub, technically, was wedged against outpost infrastructure. I built a better shelter on day 2. I'm not proud of how carefully I did this. I waited until 200 when the perimeter patrol had passed and wasn't due back for 3 hours. I used salvaged thermal mesh. A section of composite panel I reported as damaged and filed for disposal, and 2 adjustable mounting clips. I constructed something roughly 60 centimeters high, 90 wide, and 120 deep, with a floor panel that would reflect body heat back upward. I put a shallow lip on the front to act as a wind break. I ran no power to it. I wasn't insane. But the passive thermal retention, according to my rough calculations, would raise the interior temperature by about 8 to 12 degrees Celsius over ambient, which, at night, would be the difference between dangerous and survivable. The cub was watching me the entire time I built it. It had retreated to the edge of the mesh tent when I came out, but it hadn't run. When I finished the new structure, I took down the old mesh, stepped back, and went inside. 40 seconds. That's how long it took the cub to move into the new shelter. I was watching through the vent sensor. 40 seconds, and it walked in, turned around twice in that universal animal way, and lay down. Day 3, the cub ate something on its own. I didn't see what, something small, I think. Maybe one of the soil invertebrates that congregated near the moisture barriers. That told me it was healthy enough to hunt, which was a relief, and also told me it was old enough to know instinctively how to eat, which narrowed the age estimate down in my head. The scientists in the archive estimated cub independence behavior started around 8 to 10 months, so this cub was probably at least that old, which meant the survival math was slightly better than I'd initially feared. Slightly. What I couldn't figure out, and what kept me up for 2 of those 3 nights, was where the family unit was. Brath are not solitary animals. They're deeply social. The archives were full of observation data on family group behavior, territory establishment, communal denning patterns. A cub this age should have been with at minimum a mother and probably several other adults. The archive had exactly one precedent for a separated cub this young. A family group that had been disrupted by a large predatory event, something that had killed or scattered the adults, and the cub in that case had been found deceased within 48 hours. This cub was alive and eating, which meant either the family was nearby and had somehow lost track of this individual, or something had happened, and this cub had traveled farther from the disruption site than any cub in the archive records. I reported the sighting to Asiv, the Garatai interpreter, on day 2. I said I'd seen a cub near the fence during a sensor check. I didn't mention the shelter. Asiv said he'd log it with Compact Wildlife Management, and they dispatch a drone survey within 2 to 4 weeks, depending on current tasking priorities. 2 to 4 weeks. The cub had an 11% survival rate without shelter. I went home and double-checked the mounting clips on the shelter. Day 3 night, I checked the vent sensor before bed the way I'd been doing and saw the shelter was occupied and still. The cub was sleeping as far as I could tell. Normal. Fine. I went to sleep. Section 5, the morning. I woke up at 5:27. The outpost's environmental system changes the module lighting temperature at 5:30 to simulate sunrise, which your body clock eventually starts anticipating, so I almost always woke up a few minutes early. This was normal. What wasn't normal was the sound. It wasn't crying this time. It wasn't the hollow triple-tone distress call I'd heard from the original cub in the rain. It was something different, lower, more complex, almost conversational in its rhythm. Multiple sources, clearly. Not one voice but several, overlapping, each one distinct. I lay there for about 4 seconds. Then I was up. I didn't even put boots on properly. I pushed my feet into them without lacing and went to the exterior door of my module and opened it into the maintenance corridor. There were 4 cubs in the shelter. 4. The structure I'd built for one animal was holding 4 of them, somehow. They'd arranged themselves in a way that I can only describe as architecturally impressive, one along each wall and one in the center, all oriented inward in a kind of radial pattern, with the largest one at the back and the smallest one, my original cub, I was pretty sure, at the front left. The shelter was warm. I could feel the heat from 3 meters away. 4 small bodies had turned that passive thermal enclosure into something genuinely, impressively warm. They were all looking at me. Not scared, not aggressive, just looking. 8 pairs of copper mirror eyes in the gray KV-7 morning, all of them still, all of them watching me with an attention that felt weighted in a way I couldn't explain at the time. I stood there in unlaced boots in the mist and I thought, okay. This is a thing that has happened. I thought I should go report this right now. I thought I should take a picture first. I took out my personal comm unit and I took a picture. I'm not ashamed of that. It's a very good picture. I still have it. Then I went back inside, laced my boots properly, put on my jacket and went to find Asiv. Asiv was in the commissary at 5:42, which I knew he would be because Asiv started every day with what he called the first meal thinking time, which meant he sat at the corner table with a bowl of something heated and stared at the middle distance, and did not want to talk to anyone for approximately 22 minutes. I had violated this rule before and it had not gone well. I violated it again now. Asiv. He blinked at me. One of those slow blinks that usually belong to the Suleni medics. There are 4 Brath cubs in the maintenance corridor behind my module. He put down his spoon. He turned toward me more fully. His species, the Garatai, have a secondary set of processing structures behind their primary eyes, faint iridescent structures in their temporal region that pulse faintly when they're engaged in complex cognitive processing. Those lit up now. How, he said carefully, did 4 Brath cubs come to be in the maintenance corridor behind your module? I told him about the first cub, about the shelter, about the 11%, about the fence infrastructure loophole, about the additional 3 arrivals overnight. He was quiet for a long time. The loophole you are describing, he said, is not a loophole. I know. You have constructed a domicile for Category 3 uncontacted sentience individuals inside a compact outpost restricted zone. It's a pretty small domicile. Darius. He used my name, which Asif only did when he was being serious, because most of the time he called people by their role designations. The Velthari monitor the perimeter of this outpost with passive sensor arrays. They will have registered the presence of Brath biological signatures inside our fence line within hours of the first animal's arrival. I felt something shift in my stomach. They haven't said anything. They will. He picked up his spoon again, looked at it, put it back down. Or they will not say anything and will file a formal contact violation report with the compact instead, which is worse. The cub was going to die. You don't know that. 11%. He made a sound that I'd come to recognize as his equivalent of a sigh. I need to report this to Commander Vasquez. I know. She will be extremely unhappy. I know that too. And there is a strong possibility that the Velthari will use this as grounds for requesting our removal from KV-7. I had thought about that. I'd been thinking about it since day 2, but I'd also thought about the cub in the rain, about 48 hours, about what 11% looks like when you're the one in the maintenance corridor in the dark. Yeah, I said. I know. Section 7, Commander Vasquez. Commander Thea Vasquez was a small woman with iron-gray hair kept in a short braid and eyes that were the color of weathered wood. And she had a way of being very still when she was angry that was much more effective than any version of being loud about it. She was very still for quite a long time after I finished explaining. We were in her office. Asif was there. Dr. Miriam Foss from the scientific observation team was there because Asif had pulled her in while I was waiting, on the grounds that she was the outpost's resident expert on Brath biology. Dr. Foss was the opposite of Commander Vasquez in almost every measurable way. She was tall, perpetually disheveled, talked fast, and had a habit of finishing other people's sentences incorrectly. She had, at several points during my explanation, started to say something and then stopped herself, which was not typical behavior for her. The fact that she'd managed to stay quiet told me something about how serious this was. "Show me the photograph," Commander Vasquez said. I showed her. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at me. "Why for?" "I don't know." She looked at the photograph again. "Dr. Foss." Dr. Foss made a sound like she'd been holding her breath. Brath cub groups typically travel in familial cohorts when the primary family unit has been disrupted. If the mother is absent, the older cubs, even if they're only months older, will sometimes lead younger siblings or litter mates toward the nearest shelter signature. Thermal signatures. She looked at me. Your shelter put out a thermal signature. On a cold night, they followed it. Like a beacon, I said. Like a beacon, she confirmed. And once the first one found it safe, they have rudimentary communication. Not language, not yet, but the precursor systems are well documented. It would have signaled the others. Commander Vasquez set down my comm unit. What's the status of the family unit? Unknown, Asif said. I've requested a drone survey. Cancel the request. Asif paused. Commander, if we request a formal survey, we create a paper trail that the Velthari can use in a contact violation filing. We handle this internally first. She looked at Dr. Foss. Can you assess the cub's condition without removing them from the structure? Yes, I have non-contact bioscan equipment. Do it quietly and report only to me. She turned back to me. I had the feeling of a person who has stepped onto ice and is waiting to find out how thick it is. You, she said, you stay in the outpost. You do not go near that maintenance corridor. You do not take more photographs. You don't talk to anyone about this. Yes, Commander. I'm not done. She leaned forward. What you did was a violation of Compact Protocol 7 Delta regarding contact with Category 3 species. The penalties are significant. I'm choosing right now in this room not to formally log what you've told me. If anyone asks, the cubs were detected by routine sensor maintenance. Logistics specialist Kale was not involved in any contact or construction activity, and we are awaiting compact guidance. Do you understand me? I understood her. I also understood that she was covering for me, and that covering for me cost her something, and I didn't take that lightly. Yes, Commander. Good. She picked up my comm unit and deleted the photograph. I didn't tell her I'd backed it up to my personal archive before coming to see her. Some things you just keep. The signal came at 1400 hours that same day. It came through the standard compact diplomatic band, the one that both outposts were required to monitor and respond to within 4 hours. Asif flagged it immediately and brought it to Commander Vasquez, who brought it to a secure briefing with 3 other senior staff, of whom I was not one. I found out what it said from Dr. Foss, who had a talent for being in rooms she technically wasn't supposed to be in, and had pieced together the message from what Asif said during the briefing. The Velthari commander, designated in compact records as Garrison Officer Vaithran, had sent a formal communication requesting an explanation for the presence of 4 Brath biological signatures within the human outpost perimeter. Just that, no accusations, no threats, just the request. But the request itself was the move, because it put us in a position where we either admitted what had happened or we lied to the Velthari in a formal diplomatic exchange, which was a much more serious violation than anything I'd already done. Commander Vasquez sent back a reply acknowledging the communication and requesting a face-to-face meeting at the neutral exchange point, a flat, cleared area roughly equidistant between our outpost and theirs that had been designated for direct contact in exactly these kinds of situations. The meeting was scheduled for 900 the next morning. I was not supposed to be there. I was there. Dr. Foss had determined through her bioscan that the cubs were all in adequate health, slightly underweight, one with a minor respiratory irregularity that she thought would resolve on its own, all showing normal developmental markers. She'd also determined, from trace biological evidence at the shelter site, that something had happened to the family group. She didn't have enough data to say what exactly, but she'd found chemical markers in the ground near the fence that she'd matched against the archive's records of Brath stress response. Something had frightened a large group of Brath in the area proximal to our fence in the last week. Something significant. I thought about the storm, about what might have moved through the lowlands ahead of it. I thought about what might drive a mother away from her cubs, or drive a mother off. I slept badly that night. Section 9, the exchange point. The neutral exchange point at 900 on a KV-7 morning looked exactly like what it was, a cleared flat space under a bruised sky, with the silver-leaved fern trees standing in a loose perimeter and the static electricity sound moving through them in the wind. 2 Velthari environmental suits and 1 tall figure that I assumed was Vaithran. On our side, Commander Vasquez, Asif, and 2 of our security personnel. And me, 20 meters back, behind a cluster of red-stemmed growth that gave me a partial sightline. I want to be clear, I had a reason for being there that wasn't just stubbornness. Dr. Foss had given me something to bring, evidence. Biological data on the family group disruption. The kind of thing that might matter in a conversation about what the right next step was. I had it on a data slate in my jacket pocket. I watched the exchange. I couldn't hear the words. The Velthari used their subsonic communication, which Asif translated in real time via the comm unit he wore in his ear, and I didn't have access to that feed. What I could see was the body language, and body language crosses species barriers more than you might think. The Velthari commander, Vaithran, was very still in a way that was different from Vasquez's anger stillness, more like consideration, like something that had a great deal of processing going on underneath a deliberately controlled surface. Its 4 eyes were directed toward Commander Vasquez, and when Asif spoke, they shifted briefly to him and back. The conversation lasted about 12 minutes. Then something changed. I saw Commander Vasquez turn and look back toward where I was standing. I don't know how she knew I was there. Maybe she'd known all along. She made a small gesture, come forward, and I felt my stomach do something complicated, and I stepped out from behind the fern trees and walked toward the exchange point. Vaithran's 4 eyes tracked me as I crossed the distance. When I got close enough to stop at Vasquez's side, the Velthari commander did something I hadn't expected. It spoke. Not subsonic. It shifted to a frequency I could actually hear. A resonant, layered sound that Asif's earpiece picked up and translated via the outpost's shared channel that he'd apparently switched me into. What Vaithran said, in translation, was this: "You are the one who built the structure." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "The cubs are unharmed." "Yes, one may have a minor respiratory issue, but our medics believe it will resolve." Another pause. Vaithran's temporal structures, different from Asif's but serving what seemed like a similar function, pulsed in a slow, complex pattern. "We observed the family group dispersal event on KV-7 Standard Day 47, Vaithran said. A Drac predator, large. We tracked it. We did not intervene, as per compact observation protocol." A pause that felt deliberate. "We were unaware that the family group had left young behind. Our sensor coverage of the area proximal to your outpost fence has a low-priority monitoring assignment." I took a second to process that. The Velthari had been watching a predator hunt, following the rules, and they hadn't known the cubs were pinned against our fence in the rain. "How old is the protocol?" I asked. 41 of your years, Vaithran said. "The protocol is 41 years old, and it didn't account for cubs getting separated near outpost infrastructure." It did not. Another pulse of those temporal structures. "Your intervention violated compact contact regulations." "Yes." "The cubs are alive because of it." 4 of them, yes." Vaithran was quiet for a moment. "We have been observing this family group for 7 of your years. The 4 cubs are the 3rd litter of the matriarch. The family group has shown consistent, accelerating tool-adjacent behavior. They represent a significant data point in our understanding of this species' developmental trajectory." A pause. "They are significant." "They're significant to me too," I said, "and I've known them for 4 days." That should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment where the 2 sides found their footing and started working toward something sensible. And maybe it would have been, if the second Velthari at the exchange point hadn't suddenly shifted, fast and sharp in a way that looked completely unlike the deliberate precision of everything else they did, and spoken in the subsonic register that I felt rather than heard. Asif's voice came through the shared channel immediately. "Movement. Large biological signature. South-southwest." And then we all heard it. Not felt, heard. Because whatever was coming through the red-stemmed growth to our southwest was too large to be quiet about it, and it wasn't trying to be. A Drac predator on KV-7 looks nothing like what the name might suggest to someone who grew up reading science fiction. It's not a dinosaur. It's not a lizard. It's something closer to a 6-limbed, partially arboreal ambush predator that has evolved, in KV7's dense lowland vegetation, to move through thick growth by simply going through it rather than around it. Its front carapace is hard enough to shatter the red-stemmed plants instead of bending them, so it announces itself with a sound like breaking glass and snapping wood. That sound was coming fast. Vasquez had her hand on her sidearm. The security personnel had their rifles up. The Velthari second had drawn something I didn't recognize, but which emitted a low hum I could feel in my back teeth. Vaithran had not moved, just turned slowly toward the sound, and then said something in the subsonic register, and Asiv's translation came through. It is tracking biological signatures. The Cubs. My shelter was 4 clicks north of us. The Cubs were in it. Everything happened very fast after that. I want to talk about the moment just before everything went kinetic. That space of maybe 3 seconds where a situation crystallizes from something complicated and diplomatic into something simple and physical. Because in those 3 seconds, I was doing math. The Drac was tracking the Cubs. The Cubs were at the outpost. The outpost was 4 clicks north. The Drac was moving at what sounded, based on the rate of the breaking glass sound of plants shattering, like somewhere between 30 and 40 kilometers per hour, which meant it had maybe 6 or 7 minutes before it reached the outpost perimeter. 4 clicks, 6 minutes. Our patrol crawlers could cover that in 3, if one was ready to go. The outpost perimeter fence was a standard electrostatic barrier rated for Class 4 fauna, and I did not know offhand what class rating the Drac fell under, but I did know that it had been described in the archive as apex predator, all environmental contexts, no recorded natural predators. I also knew that the Cubs were in a shelter that I had built with thermal mesh and salvaged composite panels and mounting clips from a supply crawlers, that it had no power, that it was 60 centimeters high, that it was approximately as fortified as a cardboard box. The thing about doing that math in 3 seconds is that the answer comes back fast, and you don't have time to argue with it. I ran. Not back toward the exchange point vehicles. I ran straight north, back up the slope toward the outpost, cutting across the cleared zone and into the growth, following the supply track that I knew by feel because I'd walked it enough times that my feet knew the angles without my eyes needing to. I heard Commander Vasquez shout my name. I heard the sound of the exchange point falling apart behind me, movement, voices, the hum of the Velthari weapon system cycling. None of that was my problem right now. Boots in the mud, silver leaves making that static sound, sky the color of a bruise and me running under it like an idiot who had built a shelter for a lonely cub and now had 4 cubs to worry about. I hit the outpost south gate in under 9 minutes. I know that because I could see the gate timer. I had my access key out and was through before it finished opening. Outpost security, this is KAEL logistics. I was using the comm unit while running. Large BRATH Predator class, DRAK tracking signature, inbound from south-southwest, approximately 6 to 8 minutes from perimeter. We need the electrostatic fence AT full output and I need someone to confirm class rating 4 DRAK against our barrier spec. There was a pause. Then Staff Sergeant Hendricks on security watch. Kale, I need that request to go through. Hendricks, I was still running, cutting through the central ring toward the outer modules. 4 Brath Cubs, Drac Predator, 6 minutes, please. Another pause, shorter, pulling fence specs now. Go. I reached the outer ring, my module, the maintenance corridor. The Cubs were awake. They were all at the front of the shelter, ears up, oriented south with a precision that was startling. They had heard or sensed something I was only just arriving at. Their wool fur was raised along the back of their necks in a ridge pattern that I recognized from the archive records as a threat response posture. The largest one, the one in the back who had been there when I arrived this morning, was making a sound that was different from anything I'd heard from them before. Not the crying sound. Not the conversational rhythm. Something lower, with a vibration in it that I felt in the hand I pressed flat against my module wall. I crouched down at the shelter entrance. Hey. Hey, it's okay. I know that was absurd. They didn't speak English. They didn't know my name. We had the entirety of our 4-day acquaintance and a structure made of salvaged parts between us. But I crouched down and I said it anyway because my mother always said you talk to a frightened animal the same way you talk to a frightened child, not for what the words mean but for what the sound means. Calm, I'm here, not afraid. The largest cub looked at me, then it looked south, then back at me. My comm unit crackled. Hendrix, Drac is class 5. Our fence is rated to class 4.5. Kale, our fence is not rated for a Drac. Of course it wasn't. Can we run it at above rated output? For maybe 2 or 3 pulses before we risk a cascade. Get the perimeter security team to the south fence. Full gear. And someone get Commander Vasquez on the line, she's at the exchange point. She's already inbound, what's your position? Outer ring, northeast maintenance corridor. I looked at the shelter, at 4 pairs of copper eyes. I'm staying with the cubs. Silence on the line for a moment. Kale. I'm staying with the cubs, Hendrix. Get me some backup. I want to describe this accurately, because I think the scale of it matters for understanding what happened next. The Drac that came through the south fence not stopped by, was approximately 4.5 meters at the shoulder. It moved on its 4 lower limbs when it was running in the open. In dense vegetation, it dropped its body to use all 6, which was how it could crash through the red-stemmed growth at speed. Its carapace was a dark amber color, layered, with what looked like impact scarring along the flank that suggested this wasn't its first contested hunting ground. It had no visible eyes in the front-facing position. Its sensory organs were positioned laterally, which gave it a near 360 field of perception in its horizontal plane. It hit the south fence at 9:17. The fence discharged at maximum output. Hendrix authorized the overload pulse, and the Drac staggered, stopped, shook itself in a way that sent visible pulses through its carapace plates. Then it pushed through the fence like it was thick air, and the fence went dark behind it. Cascade failure, 1 pulse. It was inside the perimeter. I could hear it. Not the glass-breaking sound now, we were in cleared ground, but its movement, heavy and purposeful, and a sound from it that I can only describe as a subsonic triangulation pulse. It was finding the cubs. That's what the sound was. It was echolocating them, or something close enough to echolocation that the difference doesn't matter in the moment, and it was getting closer. The security team hit it with 3 shock rounds from the south ring walkway. Class 5, stunned spec. The Drac paused, orientated toward the fire, let out a sound that I felt in my sternum from 40 meters away, and then turned away from the security team and continued toward the outer ring. Northeast, toward me. The cubs had moved. I hadn't told them to, I hadn't done anything, but the 3 smaller ones had pressed themselves into the very back of the shelter, and the large one was standing at the entrance. Standing, not crouched to run, not flattened in fear posture. Standing with that neck ridge raised and that low vibration sound coming from somewhere deep in its chest. 4 months old, maybe, the size of a medium dog, standing between its siblings and an apex predator with its back straight and its ears forward. I felt something happen in my chest again, that door. I stood up. I put myself between the shelter and the direction the Drac was coming from. I don't have a great explanation for this beyond the one I already gave you. Who you come from shapes the kind of stupid decisions you make later. I stood up, and I didn't have a weapon, and I had my comm unit and my field torch and a data slate with Dr. Foss's biological report on it, and the Drac came around the corner of the outer ring at 9:21 and stopped. It stopped because it was suddenly looking at something unexpected. Me. A human being standing in a maintenance corridor in mud-stained work clothes and improperly laced boots, blocking the entrance to a structure that contained 4 brath cubs. Not running, not moving. Just standing there with a torch in one hand and something that might have been stubbornness or might have been sheer paralyzed terror, and from the outside probably looked about the same. Section 14, 2 minutes and 20 seconds. I know the duration because my comm unit logs automatically, and I later pulled the log. 2 minutes and 20 seconds. That's how long the Drac and I looked at each other before anything else happened. I can tell you what I was thinking. I was thinking about that Class 5 designation and what it meant that our fence couldn't hold it. I was thinking about the security team on the South Ring walkway and why they weren't firing. I was thinking about my mother's voice saying you talk to a frightened animal the same way you talk to a frightened child. I was thinking, the Drac is not frightened. The Drac has never been frightened in its evolutionary history. The Drac is a thing that has simply never encountered a situation it could not go through. And I was thinking, maybe that works in my favor. Maybe something that has always gone through things doesn't have a model for something that just stands there in the way and doesn't move. I kept the torch steady. I kept my breathing as even as I could. I didn't look away. I'd read enough about predator behavior to know that looking away was interpreted as flight preparation, and flight preparation is an invitation. I held the light at chest height, which put it somewhere in the Drac's lateral visual range, and I stood still. The large cub behind me had not stopped making that sound. The low vibration, it continued steadily like a bass line. At 1 minute and 42 seconds, something came over the South Ring walkway that I didn't understand until I watched the Drac's attention shift. Movement in my peripheral vision, from above, from the east, something fast and quiet dropping into the maintenance corridor 20 meters behind the Drac between it and its entry point. 2 somethings. Velthari. In their adaptive color environmental suits, they'd been nearly invisible against the sky until they landed. Vaithran and the second officer. They'd come over the fence with some kind of short-burn atmospheric system, not full flight, but directed thrust jump, the kind of thing that could carry you 10 or 15 meters vertically over a fence. They'd come into the outpost without permission and landed between the Drac and its exit. And Vaithran, standing 20 meters behind the Drac, activated something. Not the weapon, something else. A resonance emitter of some kind. I felt it before I heard it, a frequency that seemed to press on the inside of my skull, and the Drac reacted to it immediately. Not pain, I don't think, but something like disorientation. Its lateral sensory organs contracted, and it turned its body toward the new stimulus, away from me. It was a hurting sound. I realized that later. The Velthari had 40 years of observing the Brath, and therefore 40 years of observing everything in this ecosystem, including what frequencies produced what behaviors in apex predators. They had the tool ready. They had the knowledge. They just needed a reason to use it and a position to use it from. And I had given them the position by standing in the other direction and not moving. The Drac turned toward Vaithran, paused. The resonance increased. The Drac took one step, then another, then turned fully south. In 90 seconds it was moving back toward the south fence. The security team had restored partial power to a barrier section, and it held long enough for the Drac to push through it. It could go through, but going through was unpleasant, and with the resonance behind it, unpleasant in the direction of away was the preferred option. It was gone at 9:26. I sat down on the ground. I don't mean I chose to sit down. I mean my legs decided on their own. The Velthari second went to the south fence to supervise the barrier status. Vaithran walked down the maintenance corridor toward me. Walked is not quite the right word. That deliberate, too precise movement was more like a series of exactly calculated placements. Each step settled before the next began, like watching a very long equation solve itself toward you. I stood back up before it reached me, felt like the right call. Vaithran stopped 4 meters from the shelter. Its 4 eyes moved from me to the structure to the cubs, who had not emerged but were watching through the entrance. The large cub had moved back from the entrance now, presumably because the vibration sound had stopped. The four of them were still, watching. "You stood in its path," Vaithran said. "Without a weapon." "Yes." "You are aware that a Drak is Class 5. "I was informed of that while the Drak was coming through the fence, yes." A long pause, those temporal structures pulsing slowly. "We have been in this system for 41 of your years," Vaithran said. "We have watched your species establish outposts on contested worlds 11 times. You consistently make errors in resource management, atmospheric sealing, and diplomatic protocol. You argue about everything. Your junior personnel disobey direct orders with significant frequency." "That's fair," I said. "And approximately once per cycle, a human being does something that we cannot predict from any model we have developed." I didn't say anything. "Our models are extensive," Vaithran said. "We are good at prediction. We have been predicting galactic behavior for 600 of your years. We have a model for every species in the compact, for Garatai diplomatic maneuvering, for Sulani medical ethics decision trees, for Davari resource calculation behavior." It paused. "We do not have a reliable model for humans." "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment." "It is not," Vaithran said. "It is a problem for us." Another pause. "It is also why we have not filed a contact violation report." I looked at it. "The cubs would have died," it continued. "The family group data would have been lost. The matriarch's third litter, which shows, I should tell you, gene expression markers in the cognitive architecture that our biologists consider significant, would not have survived the night cycle. We observed the dispersal event. We did not predict the cubs would reach your fence. Our sensor coverage did not extend to that area adequately." A pause that felt weighted in a way that was not quite apology but was adjacent to it. "Our protocol would have resulted in their deaths." "Your protocol is 41 years old," I said. "Yes. And it didn't account for the thing that actually happened." "No." Vaithran's temporal structures pulsed in a pattern I hadn't seen before. "Your protocol also did not account for the thing that actually happened. And yet the cubs are alive." I looked at the shelter, at the 4 pairs of copper eyes watching us from the entrance. "What happens now?" I asked. She arrived at 9:34, with Osif and both security personnel and Dr. Foss, who had apparently followed without being asked. Vasquez took in the situation, the shelter, the Velthari, the cubs, me sitting on the ground, in about 4 seconds, and her face went through a series of expressions that I will not attempt to describe because I value my continued employment. She addressed Vaithran directly, through Osif. The conversation was long, and I only caught pieces of it because Osif was translating selectively, giving Commander Vasquez what she needed and not running a live feed through the shared channel. Dr. Foss sidled up next to me at some point and said very quietly, "The bioscan shows the cubs are fine. Better than fine, actually. Core temperatures are better than we'd expect for the ambient conditions. Your shelter works." "I know." I looked up the archive records on this family group. She was speaking just above a whisper. "Vaithran is not wrong about the gene expression markers. The matriarch's lineage shows faster prefrontal analog development than any other Brath family group in 40 years of records. These cubs, if the research team is right, these cubs are special in the way that will matter in about 50 years when whatever they have now has become language." I thought about that. About the cub I'd watched walk into the shelter in 40 seconds and turn around twice. About the large one standing at the entrance in front of its siblings, with its neck ridge up. "The big one," I said, "the one that stood its ground when the Drak came." "What about it? Is that normal behavior for a cub that age?" Dr. Foss was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "no, it's really not. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of Commander Vasquez and Vaithran at a table in the outpost's diplomatic meeting room, an optimistic name for a room with 6 chairs, a projection surface, and a water dispenser that made a sound like someone clicking their tongue, working through something that was going to have to be filed with the compact eventually, but needed to be shaped carefully before it went anywhere official. I sat outside in the corridor for most of it. Asif came out twice to ask me questions, both times specific factual things about the shelter construction that they apparently needed to establish in the documentation. I answered accurately. I didn't embellish. What came out of that room, as I understood it later, was this. The shelter was reclassified, not as prohibited contact, but as emergency environmental intervention under outpost infrastructure adjacency provisions, which was not a real provision that existed before that day. But Asif was very good at his job, and Commander Vasquez had been in compact diplomatic negotiations long enough to know how language works, and Vaithran, it turned out, had reasons of its own to prefer a resolution that didn't require the formal contact violation pathway. The Brath family group, the matriarch and the surviving adults, had been tracked by Velthari sensors and located approximately 18 clicks southeast. The Drac disruption event had scattered them, but they were regrouping. A Velthari observation team would monitor their movement and facilitate passive guideback toward the outpost perimeter area, where the cubs would be placed outside the fence for natural reunification. The sensor coverage gap adjacent to the outpost would be addressed. And there would be a joint protocol review, 41-year-old documents getting looked at by both sides. No promises, just a review. That was the agreement. The reunification was planned for the following morning. The matriarch and 2 adult family members had been tracked to 12 clicks southeast and were moving north at a pace the Velthari observers assessed as purposeful. They were looking for their cubs. Of course they were. I was not supposed to be involved in the reunification process, compact wildlife management protocol, which was now actually being followed, specified that all contact during the handover phase needed to be minimized. Dr. Foss and Asif would manage the shelter relocation outside the fence. I was to stay in my module. I stayed in my module until 4:15. At which point I was definitively awake and could not pretend otherwise, and I went to the vent sensor and watched. Dr. Foss and 2 of the Suleni medics, who moved very quietly and had the patience for this kind of careful work that I admired, had moved the shelter structure earlier in the night, positioning it just outside the south fence opening that had been manually unlocked for the purpose. The cubs were in it. They'd resisted the move initially. The large one had made the vibration sound and flattened its ears, but once the thermal structure was reassembled around them, they'd settled. The matriarch arrived at 4:37. Through the vent sensor I could see her approach from a distance first, a dark shape larger than the cubs, moving differently, without the cubs still developing plate fur. She was followed by 2 others, one adult male by the size of him, and one that the archive would later identify as a juvenile from the previous litter, maybe 3 years old, well on its way to adult size. The matriarch stopped about 15 meters from the shelter, raised her head, made a sound that I did not have the words for then and don't have them now, something that went through the vent panel and through the wall of my module and sat somewhere in my chest where it hasn't entirely left. The large cub came out of the shelter first. It walked toward the matriarch with the same straight-backed posture it had used at the shelter entrance when the Drac came. Not running, not scrambling, just walking. It stopped 2 meters from the matriarch and they looked at each other for a long moment, and then the matriarch lowered her broad, flat head, and the cub pressed against her neck, and the matriarch's 2 forelegs, the manipulator limbs, came down and around it in something I could not call anything other than what it was. The other 3 came out one by one. The smallest one ran, which was more what I'd expected, ran in that slightly uncoordinated way that very young animals run when they've decided they're done being afraid and want to close the distance as fast as possible. The adult male made a sound that was different from the matriarch's, deeper, faster, and went to each cub in sequence, making what I can only describe as an inventory check, the way parents of young children will sometimes account for each child by sight and by touch. The juvenile from the previous litter did something unexpected. It approached the shelter itself and stood in front of it, examining the structure, sniffing it, moving around it slowly. It spent about 90 seconds on this examination. Then it turned toward the outpost fence and looked for a few seconds at the space beyond it. Then it turned back to its family group, and they left together. The shelter stood empty, silver leaves moving in the wind, sky the color of a bruise going gray with the approach of KV7's morning. I sat in front of my vent sensor for a long time after they were gone. 3 weeks later, I got a formal notification from Compact Protocol Administration. It was filed under my name and cross-referenced against my service record. The notification said that my actions on KV7 Standard Day 47 through 51 had been reviewed under the Emergency Environmental Intervention provisions. The new ones, the ones that hadn't existed until Commander Vasquez and Vaithran sat in a room together for 4 hours, and had been determined to be within the parameters of those provisions. Which is to say, I wasn't in trouble. Commander Vasquez told me this in person, which she didn't have to do. She told me in the same still, weathered-wood-eyes way she told me most things. She said, "You violated about 4 separate protocols and created a diplomatic incident that took me 4 hours to resolve." I said, "Yes, Commander." She said, "The cubs are alive." I said, "Yes, Commander." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Don't do it again." She left without giving me any indication of what she thought about any of it, which, from Commander Vasquez, I took as an endorsement. Asif told me, about a month after the reunification, that the Velthari garrison had begun a full sensor coverage audit of the area surrounding the outpost. Not announced, not formally shared with us. Asif had picked it up through secondary compact diplomatic channels, and mentioned it to me in what I was learning was his version of passing something significant along without making it into something official. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Asif said, "that they are concerned about gaps." "The sensor gaps." "Yes," he did the slow blink. "It also means that 41-year-old documents are being looked at." Dr. Foss published a preliminary report on the family group's biological data, the gene expression markers, the cognitive architecture observations, the behavioral data from the shelter period. It went through the standard compact science channels. I didn't read the full thing. I don't have the biology background for most of it. But she told me, over coffee one afternoon, that the section on the large cub's threat display behavior during the Drac encounter had generated, and I'm quoting her here, "a not small amount of interest from people who care about these things." "What do the people who care about these things say?" I asked. She thought about it. "They say it's consistent with what the cognitive models predict would start emerging at this stage of the developmental trajectory. Protective social behavior as a formalized response, rather than just instinct. The distinction matters. It means decision-making. It means the cub made a choice to stand there." I thought about that for a while. About a 4-month-old creature the size of a medium dog, choosing to stand at the entrance of a shelter it had lived in for 4 days, in front of 3 smaller siblings, facing something that had no natural predators. "It worked," I said. "It worked because you were already standing there," Dr. Foss said. "I was already standing there because the cub was behind me." She smiled at that. It was the kind of smile that meant she thought that was the whole point and was pleased I'd found my way to it. I still have the photograph. The one Commander Vasquez deleted off my comm unit, the backup copy I'd made to my personal archive before going to her office. 4 cubs in a shelter made of thermal mesh and salvaged panels, in the early gray light of a KV-7 morning. 8 copper eyes looking back at the camera. 4 pairs of enormous triangular ears, still too big for the heads underneath them. The large one is in the back right. You can see, if you know to look for it, that its neck ridge is slightly raised even then. Even in the few seconds of calm before I walked in from outside, even in a shelter, watching. I don't know what the Brath will look like in 50 years. I don't know what they'll look like in 100 or 200, when whatever they have now has become language and tools, and the organized social complexity that the Compact calls sentience in the full political sense. I won't be alive to see that. I'm a 31-year-old logistics specialist on a contested outpost at the edge of the Velthari zone, and the math on my lifespan versus the Brath developmental timeline is not favorable. But I think about the large cub sometimes. I think about the choice Dr. Foss said it made, the deliberate one, the one that shouldn't have been possible at that age according to the models, the one that happened anyway. I think about what it means that the first time one of them made that choice, they made it in a shelter a human built for them, in a structure that a specific 31-year-old idiot from New Asheville put together at 200 on a rainy night because 11% wasn't a number he could live with. I don't know if that matters. To them, to the biology, to the trajectory. Dr. Foss thinks it probably doesn't. She thinks the markers were already there, that the behavior was already coming, that the shelter was circumstantial. Maybe, probably. But Vaithran told me in the exchange point that they don't have a reliable model for humans, that it's a problem, that they're good at predicting everything else in the galaxy and humans are the thing they keep getting wrong. I think about that too. I think about what it means that the galaxy has been running its models for 600 years, and they keep coming up short when a human being decides to do something, because 11% isn't a number they can live with. Maybe that's not a bug. I have 11 months left on my second rotation. After that, I can take the land grant on any established colony world and go build something permanent. Something with proper walls and a real power supply and a perimeter that can handle a Class 5 predator. I haven't decided yet. There's a colony world in the Selthari corridor that's supposed to be nice, good atmospheric pressure, regular light cycles, nothing apex in the local fauna. Easy, comfortable. But there's also KV-7, and I know what's on KV-7. I know the bruised sky and the static electricity sound in the silver leaves and the smell of copper and wet stone. I know the supply tracks. I know which crawlers run cold in the morning and need an extra 5 minutes before you push them hard. I know the faces of 80 people who are out here for different reasons and have mostly found their way to the same one. And I know that somewhere in the lowlands, 18 clicks southeast and ranging, there is a family group with 4 cubs, 3 of average developmental markers and 1 that is, according to the Compact Science channels, currently generating what Dr. Foss calls a not small amount of interest from people who care about these things. I know that the large cub made a choice. And I know that sometimes, when the environmental lighting goes down for the night cycle and the module is quiet, I sit at the vent sensor out of habit and look at the maintenance corridor, at the empty space where a 60-centimeter structure made of salvaged parts used to be. And the corridor is empty, and the fence sensors blink their steady green. And sometimes I think I hear something, in the far distance, past the perimeter, in the direction of the silverleaf trees with the static electricity sound. Something low, something with a vibration in it. Something that carries. I'm probably imagining it. But I don't think I am.